On behalf of Columbia Global Center Beijing and the Committee on Global Thought, it is our great pleasure to welcome you to today's critical discussion titled Navigating U.S.-China Flux, Asia's Strategic Choices in a New Global Orders. As a brief introduction, I'm Helena Schell. I'm based in Beijing with the Beijing Global Center, and our partner for this event, the Columbia Global Thought Committee. We are both the peer unit under a bigger or larger Columbia Global Initiative called Columbia Global. So it's really our pleasure to present this program with you. Very briefly about this program, I think we gathered at a pivotal moment as power structures are shifting. Economic alliances is realigning, and Asia in general is finding itself at the center of geopolitical and geoeconomic transformation. So today's conversation, I believe, could be more timely. So with the United States deepening its engagement in the Indo-Pacific and China's influence reshaping the regional dynamics, Asian nations face both unprecedented challenges and of course, possibilities. So this webinar brings together leading experts to examine these issues, not as passive observer, but as active architects of the future. So we're very honored to have Professor Adam Tooze, Columbia Kathryn, and Shelby, Cullom Davis Professor of History, Chair of the Committee on Global Thought, and the Director of European Institute at the university to moderate this discussion. Under his guidance, we also have distinguished panelists representing various insights and perspectives. We'll offer their observation and their insights from across the region, so helping to help us map Asia's evolving role in the new era. They are Professor Shiping Tang, Fudan Distinguished Professor, and Dr. Seaker Chen, Chair Professor of the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University. Welcome, Professor Tang. We also have Francis Lei, Director of the Institute of Development Economics, Macau University of Science and Technology. Welcome you, Professor Lei. We also have Ms. Shikoto Guto, Senior Fellow for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Mansfield Foundation. Welcome, Ms. Guto. And last but definitely not least, Professor Francisco Mancini, Vice Dean and Associate Professor in Practice at National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So welcome, Professor Mancini. So at Columbia Global Center, we believe in the power of dynamic to illuminate the pathway forward. So today's exchange is not just academic, it's I would say necessary step forward, understanding the choices that will define stability, prosperity, and cooperation in the years ahead. So I encourage every one of you to engage actively in the Q&A session. So now, without further ado, I will pass the microphone to Professor Tooze. The floor is all yours, please.
Hello from New York. Thank you so much, Helena, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure for Columbia, the Committee on Global Thought here in Columbia, and as fellow members of Columbia Global to be collaborating with the Beijing Center. We wouldn't have been able to put this unique panel together without your help, and it's a real testament, I think, to the value of the ongoing collaboration and investment that Columbia makes in the network of global centers around the world. There have been previous sessions in this series with Helena's colleagues in Istanbul and Amman, with our colleagues in Nairobi as well, and with folks in Rio. It's a unique network, and precisely the kind of latticework network of connections that we need, I think, in the current situation to make sense of the dramatically changing world around us. And I personally look forward to further collaboration with the Beijing Center, perhaps as soon as this summer. So thank you for setting this up for us. I mean, one of the lessons I think we're all learning is that in a moment of disorder like the one that we currently face, the first thing you should stop assuming is that your particular take on what the disorder is the prevalent assumption and understanding of the disorder of everyone else in the disordered world, because one of the things that we lose in the process of the disordering are, however unstable those assumptions may always have been, whatever those assumptions were about the common vantage point, the common interpretation of that world, they go, and they go early on. And I learned this lesson hard by thinking about what I termed the polycrisis and giving lectures in South Africa and discovering that from South Africans' point of view, the polycrisis is not a current shock, but a half-century experience of crisis. So I think as my opening question to this wonderful panel, I would actually just start with a kind of roundup stock-taking exercise. How does the world look from your vantage point at this moment? I thought maybe we'd start with Shihoko and then go to Shiping in Shanghai, to Francis, and then Francesco in that order, kind of following a rough geographic arc. How does this moment look from your vantage point, Shihoko?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Adam, and a big thank you to the Columbia Global Center in Beijing for organizing this event and inviting me to such a timely discussion. And what a big question. But let me first try to wrap up and say there are shared challenges in managing relations between the United States and China. And it's really a seismic shift in the global order. And even though these countries, the world's biggest economies, have both benefited from the rules that were established after World War II. And when we turn to Japan, it's almost in a unique position amongst the advanced economies because it remains relatively stable, not just economically, but also politically as well. And so we see the rise of domestic challenges, the rise of populism. In here, I'm based in the United States, in Washington. Certainly, here there is this growing voice of conservatism, of populism. We see that across Europe. We're seeing challenges to the system in South Korea and the like. But as Japan prepares for an upper house election this summer, we're not going to see what we had seen, for instance, in Canada. This is not going to be a referendum about how Japan sees itself vis-a-vis the Trump administration. Indeed, there isn't going to be this prominent play about foreign policy per se, even though that will remain a fundamental concern for the Japanese voters. In essence, even though there is great uncertainty about US foreign policy under the Trump administration, there is a broad understanding in Japan that strong relations with the United States will remain key for its own national interest, as well as for regional stability across the Indo-Pacific. One thing that I do want to add is that Trump has repeated that he likes Japan. In every public event that he has, he says that Japan, he does like and respect Japan. And following that, he will take on actions and policies that will be quite hostile to Japan as well. Japan is going to be focusing on the long game to manage relations with the United States without jeopardizing its own strategic interests. It has an eye to achieving its immediate goals with the United States, especially when it comes to trade relations. But it's already thinking about what relations will be with the United States beyond the Trump administration and what kind of relationship Japan wants to have with the United States beyond the next 3 years.
Thank you, Shihoko, for that very measured opening to this round. Shiping, if I can move to you again, this same question: how does this moment of disorder look from your vantage point? I know you're a very long distance thinker. I gather you started your career as a molecular biologist, very interested in the evolutionary dimension. I'm particularly curious to hear how you gauge the current conjuncture.
All right. Okay. So I will leave some of the more specific things about U.S.-China relation to maybe to the next or the third question. Let me start with three broader kind of points. And I would first argue, I think the world has, entered an age of upheaval since the 2001 9/11 terrorist attack, partially because that was a truly a dramatic event. It was a tragic attack upon United States, but the key things was perhaps the United States became very angry and actually vengeance, and therefore it went on, you may call it a rampage of doing a few not really so wise things. So that kind of things, because U.S. was a long superpower, and therefore its power and its effect, its behavior has far more consequential impact upon the world than any other major powers. Although some other major power may still be able to shape the world order. So I think we are witnessing an ongoing age of upheaval, may actually last until, say, maybe another 10, 25 years. So I think the first half century of this particular century will be age of upheaval. And I think, so what we are seeing today is not something truly certain or, unprecedented, I would put it this way. The second point I want to make is really, I think from, not just from China, but from other, I think all the other countries in the world, we are seeing the United States as an unreliable and unpredictable power, because we used to live in a world in which we can have a more or less stable expectation about what the U.S. will do, what the U.S. won't do. But now we don't have the expectation anymore. And I think, as a human species, we hate unpredictability, or we don't really like uncertainty. And therefore, I think all the countries, every country in this particular planet will have to adjust and try to plan and sometimes react toward what's going on inside the United States, but also some of the unintended, indirect, and also delayed impact of what the U.S. has been able to do. The third thing is really, I would argue from a purely neutral observer kind of what's going on inside the United States, it's really, I think many will argue or agree that some of the things the U.S. wants to do or put its house in order is entirely understandable. But there may be some other things which the United States should actually focus on, but actually didn't really want to go through the painful process of doing things. For instance, it's understandable the United States wants to reduce its trade deficit, but the really creeping impact, or the kind of pressure is really on the U.S. Budget deficit. It's like 3.5 trillion or 35 trillion, and that's far larger than, let's say, 1 trillion or trade deficit. So let me stop here.
So I have two contrasting but actually complementary indices. I have Shihoko's sort of calm Japan, calculating, voting. We have Shiping's really stark characterization of the United States as upset, aggressive, as unreliable, and as evasive, as evading the true sources of instability. Francis, as an economist, it would be really great to get your take, and specifically in Hong Kong, after all, a country whose currency is pegged to the dollar. Fascinating configuration from your point of view.
I think the United States made some important contributions to the world in the past. Well, the World Trade Organization actually was mainly established by the rules laid down by the U.S. government. And that has started a very long process of globalization. And globalization means that different countries should could rely on each other. Each country should specialize in certain commodities, and then they trade with each other. And given this, the productivity of the whole world will improve. And during the last several decades, we have also seen the emergence of a lot of very efficient supply chains. Now, the US seems to be playing another role. Now, well, if we have a globalization, then countries would have to depend on each other. And that should also mean that, there should be a greater chance for peace. You don't try to fight or attack other countries, because if you try to do so, that will damage your own market. However, in recent years, the US government has tried to weaponize trade or weaponize international trade. And this is because the US government seems to believe that since you have to rely on me, then if you don't listen to me, then I will punish you by using certain sanctions or by raising the tariff rates and so on and so forth. That is undermining the rules laid down by the US government a long time ago. And the prospect of this will be quite bad. This is because we are moving in the direction of reversed globalization. And in the last several decades, globalization has helped to improve productivity. And if we move in the opposite direction, productivity could slow down or even deteriorate. And that will in turn cause some sort of recession, or if we are very unlucky, then that would also even cause some sort of depression. Certainly, nobody wants to see this kind of thing happening. And also, when trade is disappearing, it will mean that the world will be more divided. We are no longer having this kind of linkage between the different countries because the trading activities are disappearing. So I'm quite pessimistic on this issue, unless the different leaders in various countries will be more intelligent. Say, in Asian countries, I do think that they will try to engage in, or they will try to expand the kind of free trade agreement with each other, and they will try to make themselves more open. And the US government, I believe, has been following a kind of rather useless way to say try to contain China or try to threaten some other countries, and the trade I hope will continue, or the greater openness will continue with a lot of the Asian countries.
Thank you, Francis. So, Francesco, it'd be great to complete this overview with the Singaporean perspective.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you to Columbia University for having me. Not easy to add something to this very comprehensive analysis. I'll try to organize my thoughts in 3 moments, and I want to give a short-term perspective, a medium-term, and a long-term perspective. So on the short term, I think the world right now is fundamentally focused on the issue of tariffs and trade, with a lot of the implication that Francis just mentioned that goes beyond trade. But fundamentally, that's the main concern, and which means in the short term, less growth. And that's in Asia is a big concern. I would argue that, the first 50 days of the new US administration was fundamentally focusing on traditional allies, Canada, Mexico, Europe. But with the move in April with the tariffs, 57 of the countries in that famous menu list, 22 of them are in Asia. So more than 40% of these countries were in Asia. So Asia kind of woke up to, this kind of shock. Basically, what happened is that if you were a country, developing country, particularly economy, which was able to sell products that are cheap to the US, and so being good, basically, in producing low-cost product that Americans like, they've been punished the hardest. And in fact, countries like Cambodia, for example, and Malaysia or Vietnam got hit very hard. So that's a big reality. In the short term, I think this is the outlook, rather kind of pessimistic, a big concern on growth. However, I would argue that there is a medium and a long-term perspective here to take into consideration. And in the medium term, I'm trying to bring in, and maybe we can talk more about it later, the more opportunity angle. To paraphrase a famous Spider-Man quote, with great uncertainty comes great opportunity. So because of this fluidity, right, all of a sudden, you can have windows of opportunity. Countries will start to rethink a lot of policies. I think in the short term, fundamentally, they will start to rethink about trade policies, which basically means that country like, China, Korea, Japan will, they agreed again to have, more conversations, and maybe they will. Personally, I think that the most important relationship going forward in this century is actually the India-China relation. If they're able to overcome some historic tensions, that's the potential that is enormous. You can see the European Union coming toward the CPTPP. You can see many other things that we can mention later. And finally, the long-term perspective. And here, when we talk about long-term, I think we can only talk about scenarios. I think we can imagine a scenario in which the US is eventually less involved in the Asian security landscape. If so far the big question has been how to navigate the paradox of economic cooperation with China on one hand and security alignment with the US on the other hand, the underlying assumption of this paradox is that US is still interested in providing security guarantees around the world. But if that interest is not there, then the paradox is not there either. And that really opened up this question. Why would US be interested in defending a region in which its economic involvement is diminishing, basically? And this has implication beyond security because there is issue related to the de-dollarization of the economy. And I would say also overall on global governance. You can claim that some institutions were already stuck. We can claim that WTO has not been working for a long time. But certain rules of engagement, right? The idea of that, for example, the most favored nation, tariff, that was something that was still there, right? Now, we're not only kind of undermine the institution, but kind of get rid of the rules. That's in the long term will have an effect. But I think right now it's very hard to make any prediction on that.
Yes, I think that's a very good way of summarizing the situation, and an awful lot does depend on the development essentially of the composition of the American governing elite, whether or not these are people that still buy into. They may disagree, the Biden people disagree with much about how the WTO operated after all. They were by no means congenial to the WTO, but they understood that it was worth trying to think about global trade architectures, or at least mega regional trade architectures. And we just don't know, frankly, what the development of American politics is. But I want to park that because I really think that with such a brilliant panel situated with so many vantage points on Asia that we have here, let's see whether we can bracket America. I don't know, it's a hard thing to do, but do you think we can? Let's see whether we can spend like 50 minutes not talking about the US. Shahoko, there was already in your opening comment, and also in our pre-discussions, we already touched on this, a kind of a desire to talk about the current conjuncture, much as Francesco was beginning to do, as a zone also of possibility, as a zone for new kinds of agency, new kinds of flexibility, new kinds of options. I want to talk in a minute about where the resources might come from, where the agency might come from to actually exploit those options. But maybe we could just start by mapping what you see the potential as being. Yes, there is Japan is going to have a relationship with the United States. This is its fate since the 19th century. It can't not. But where else and what else is on the agenda in Japan?
Yeah, so you're putting a very big challenge here because we want to avoid talking about the United States, but that is essentially setting the agenda, and how countries respond, including Japan, is going to be this big, immediate, medium, and longer term challenge as well. But as we look at where Japan sits, and even though it does see close relations with the United States is critical for both its economic as well as its security future. There are divergences, obviously, between Washington and Tokyo, and this whole idea that the United States is presenting right now, talking about the tariff policies that the United States is pursuing, is much bigger than simply about trade relations. It's trying to rethink its own domestic economic resilience. It's trying to redefine globalization. It's pursuing a re-globalization, so to speak. And these are not necessarily areas that Japan shares with the United States. Now, Japan will say one of the biggest challenges that it faces that it shares is the China challenge. And if the United States comes with a policy that will enhance Japan's competitiveness with China, then the United States and Japan can work closely together. That said, on the economic front, we have already seen a reimagining of the regional economic architecture without the United States. And Japan has actually taken a key role in moving forward with that. And we've seen Japan really running with the idea of the United States dropping out of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though Washington was one of the key instigators of that pact. CPTPP has not just succeeded, but it's flourished without the United States. Now the question is, can Japan do more? It has actually been at the forefront of coming up with this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Can it do more insofar as it can find the commonalities, not necessarily shared values, but shared interest amongst like-minded countries that are concerned about both the challenges coming from China as well as the United States? And also this concern about social instability, which is where we are seeing all of these domestic opposition to some of the status quo, some of the systems that have been in place that have not necessarily benefited countries at large. We are seeing Japan taking a more proactive role in doing what it does well. And we are seeing a vacuum with the retreat of the United States, especially on the development assistance front. Japan has been the biggest provider of development assistance to Southeast Asia in particular. But of course, the Southeast Asian countries, many, such as Thailand and Malaysia, are very successful now, and they are ready almost to not be dependent as much, or if at all, to ODA from Japan. And so Japan is at this threshold where it needs to determine what kind of relationship it wants to have with Southeast Asia moving forward, even if without the leverage of providing financial assistance. Can it actually be this provider or leader when it comes to ensuring that like-minded countries across Southeast Asia and indeed the global South can rally around as they look to promoting their own respective interest? And the interest is, of course, stability, predictability, and perhaps a more Japanese and perhaps a more European perspective would be about the social compact and delivering on shared common and global goods.
Can I just a quick follow on, and then I'll move to Shiping and Francis. Do you think there's any conceivable scenario in which Tokyo can live with Chinese accession to the CPTPP?
Japan is pushing back very hard against that, but the remaining countries, many of the remaining countries are very open to it.
That's why I'm asking. Yeah.
So
It would seem
I
to be a
think
critical indicator of how much wiggle room there really is in this relationship.
right. Again, I mean, what Japan has been doing, it has been having more conciliatory relations with China. So we see China, Japan, China, and South Korea working towards a trilateral trade agreement as well. And we are seeing Japan not retreating from China per se, but actually hedging its own risks with China as well. But CPTPP is potentially a red line when it comes to Japan's trade relations with China, that Japan is very protective of the high rules and high standards that the CPTPP offers, and that China coming into this framework would make it not as valuable to Japan from a strategic perspective as well.
Thank you. Shiping, can I ask you about this angle of the opportunities? You described for us, a rather bleak vision of a world challenged by the crisis of American power in those three dimensions that you laid out for us: the aggression, the unpredictability, the unwillingness to really face the challenges of the moment. Is there opportunity in that scenario that you sketched for us? If so, where are the lines of opportunity?
All right. I'm not entirely pessimistic. I would argue, I think as a country for China, I think certainly China sees more challenges ahead in the next maybe 3 or 5 years: economic slowdown, U.S. sanction, tariffs, those kind of stuff. But China has been preparing for this particular moment, or particular Trump moment, or Biden or Harris moment for quite a while. So China has been planning, and therefore it has actually set up a few policy goals or potential outlets for taking on some of the challenges. And I would just single out the two, I would argue. And first is, as many of you have already known, China has been able to divert its trade from overly dependent on the United States to more trade with other developing countries, but also European countries, and also Japan and South Korea. Although there was some trade with Southeast Asia countries, between China and Southeast Asian countries, you actually kind of rewrote to the United States. But even given that, I think China has dramatically increased its trade with other developing countries. So China has been preparing for this particular moment, and I think this, in the long run, will actually provide China with more opportunities. In the sense, I think, if I may, I want to add, I think one of the key competition between US and China is actually really how much or what kind of a public goods US and China is preparing to offer to other developing countries. And right now, I think many developing countries may still see the US as an ultimate market, but they are also being able to see that China may be able to offer, more kind of a stable, reliable public goods, not just exclusively to the One Belt, One Road initiative, but also other trading and also financial investment, those kind of stuff. So China does see some opportunities. Now, I would also argue, I think this is like a strange thing in a way. It's a curse, but also it's a blessing in the sense, most Asian countries, I would argue, when the United States is treating some of the Asian countries well, they don't really actually think about getting together, or not even, let alone saying, getting close or getting together with China. So when the United States is treating ASEAN countries or Japan or South Korea well, they don't really think too much about, getting together. So it's a typical divide and rule kind of a game. But you know, because Trump is now doing all the good and the bad things against all other countries, and therefore Asian countries will have more incentive to come together, and that I think also offer a particular kind of opening for China. But I think this particular logic can be applied to other developing countries in Latin America, in Africa, and even Europe or Middle East. So I do think, as a whole, in a way, the whole world may actually benefit from the disruption caused by the Trump economics. I would put it that way.
Francis, is there any silver lining? I mean, we spoke ahead of time about the issue of currencies. De-dollarization was mentioned. Is there, from the Hong Kong vantage point, is there anything that you see that seems?
Yes. I think Asian countries will have to respond to the new changes of this current environment. So we have to take into account what the American administration will be doing. Well, let me just mention a couple of things. Because of this kind of very volatile or unstable policies of the US, well, people will have to worry about the stability of the US dollar. And you can see that some countries or the governments of some countries have already been dumping some of the US dollar reserves. Okay. Now, well, from China's perspective, it is not really a good idea for the US dollar to collapse. This is because that will hurt China tremendously. But if China believes that, well, the US administration is going to use the US dollar as one of its weapons, then China will be forced to make some other considerations. Okay. Now, I'm from Hong Kong, and that will be, I mean, the US dollar is a particular concern for Hong Kong. This is because the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, and we call it a currency board. It is a hard fixed peg. Okay. And that will mean that if the US dollars perform very badly, then the Hong Kong dollar will also perform very badly, and that will hurt the entire financial center of Hong Kong. Okay, so we certainly do not like to see that to happen. But I believe that, well, certain people in our economy may have to think about the plan B, so plan C's and so on, just for the sake of defending the Hong Kong economy in case that there's some big trouble related to the US dollar. Well, this is not something that the Hong Kong government likes to do, but if we anticipate that there will be some big changes in the US dollar, or perhaps the US administration could use the US dollar to weaponize the US dollar to attack the financial center of Hong Kong, then Hong Kong must protect itself. Well, all of this kind of things could cause major disruptions in the global scene. This is because Hong Kong is one of the three biggest, most important international financial centers in the world. I certainly don't hope that these sorts of things would happen. But given this kind of unreliability of the current US administration, and given the fact that many major or well-known or prominent economists in the United States don't think that this administration knows what it is doing, and well, then we cannot blame other countries or other places to take a defensive role. And I'm sorry to say that in the old days, when I was educated in the United States, there were a lot of great economists. And today, I think that there are still many of them who are very, very good. But apparently, the administration does not seem to have been educated by these economists. And the United States also used to have a lot of very good sinologists, people who understand, say, China. They know how the Chinese think. But apparently, today, these sinologists do not seem to have any influence on the current administration, and therefore we see a lot of misunderstanding going on. So yes. Things are not really very good. Okay.
No, we certainly do have an issue with cadre recruitment and nomenclatura management in the United States right
now. Let me add one more point about Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Now, we have been talking about the high tariff rate, but you know that Hong Kong traditionally has been having almost a zero tariff on almost everything, and Hong Kong has decided to continue with this policy, and with this, Hong Kong has benefited a lot. This is because there have been a lot of tourists coming to Hong Kong to take advantage of the zero tariffs here. Just during the last few days, it was the so-called Golden Week in China. So there have been a lot of tourists from the mainland coming to Hong Kong. And there have been a record number of tourists coming to Hong Kong and to buy and to spend money here. So Hong Kong, in this regard, is actually is taking advantage of this high tariff rates elsewhere. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues I'm quite concerned about is how far folks in the West will actually register what's going on when it does go up, because there've been extraordinary movements by historic standards in the exchange rate of the Taiwanese currency and the Singaporean currency against the dollars in the last week, and it's as though no one noticed in the West. Like these are the dollar system creaking, pulling apart at the seams when the Taiwanese currency and the Singaporean currency shift significantly against the dollar. These are seismic movements, and they barely register, even in the financial pages in the West. Francesco, you, in terms of opportunities for the future, you put on the horizon and on our agenda the issue of China-India relations. With Shihoko, we were talking Japan, China, but that surely is one of the dimensions, one of the avenues through which one might imagine a really dramatically different future. Do you see that as being facilitated, enabled by do you have a similar story about everyone in Asia being treated badly? Because the Indians are actually celebrating, aren't they? Because they only have a 25% tariff. So they actually feel like they're beneficiaries. They're a kind of mega Hong Kong.
Yes. So again, when we talk about opportunities, the risk is that we sound naive, right? Because all these opportunities actually come with huge challenges. There is, I would call it a policy muscle, right, in countries and in elites, that it takes time before you start to move in different directions, and nothing more kind of settles than China and India relations. However, if I can throw that in, however, let's just take the last few months. Xi Jinping described China-India bilateral relation a month ago, because this year is the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relation between the two countries. He described the relation as a tango between the dragon and the elephant, right? So it's a nice image. But we see that, for example, Chinese companies are moving their production to India. It shows that there is a New Delhi-Beijing partnership that can kind of start to, show some movement there. I don't want to say that all this is happening because of the US. So I think one key way you start to think about the world is that stop thinking that everybody wakes up in the morning, look at what US is doing, and then they choose what to do, right? That's not the case. Of course, because the US is such a relevant country and such a huge economy, has an impact on everybody. But, we ran election here in this country and nobody talked about US, right? So what I'm saying is that this rapprochement between China and India, it doesn't have to necessarily do with US, of course, has part of it, but it can also happen because the 21st century is the Asia century. And to have a full completion of the Asia century, you really need a different relationship there. There's obviously a huge trade deficit challenge there, right? And there is a challenge of risking to be flooded by cheap product. This is a challenge. Shipping, and both friends has mentioned, China is of course thinking about other outlet where they can sell their production, but that creates also problem in some countries. Indonesia, for example, has a huge textile challenge during the first Trump administration because of tariffs that were put on China, sending some companies in bankruptcy. So I'm not saying this with a naive kind of point of view. There are challenges ahead, but I really think that there are indications that countries and leaders in countries are starting to think and to look at the world in a different way. I make two quick examples, very concrete examples of these days. One is the topic of sustainability. This is a topic that I would say 98% of the world is fully committed. I was talking this morning with someone in the Royal Court of the UAE. Some of you might remember the UAE hosted the 2023 COP meeting. They're fully committed. They just want to continue exactly where they're going. A second interesting example is philanthropy. As I speak, where Singapore is hosting the Philanthropy Asia Summit. Today, Bill Gates has announced that he's going to open a Gates Foundation headquarters in Singapore. There are some estimates that the potential of philanthropy in Asia is around $700 billion. They already donate around 33 billion. So what I'm saying is there is a strategic autonomy and a regional leadership that can be fostered by fluidity, right? And so I think that we start to see it in different directions.
Quick question to our Beijing team. Would love to get some questions in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. If you could prompt our audience for questions, maybe they could go in the chat or the Q&A. Would love to be able to do that in the final phase as we enter the final phase of this fascinating panel. But I actually want to take up again a point that or a pointer that you were giving us, Francesco, which is about one way of reading what you've just said is diverse points of agency, right? There are different issues around which people are still organized, like sustainability. But then when you start speaking about philanthropy, we're talking about a different group of actors. And very often in this conversation so far, we've done the just conventional necessary generalization, China this, America that, Japan that, Singapore the other. But we haven't really been thinking in a concrete way about who the actors are of this system. And states, governing elites, we've had a few critical things to say about the people in charge in the US, are one set of actors. But we can all do the kind of anatomy in our heads, right? It's state bureaucracies as opposed to politicians. It's the defense establishment as opposed to the econ people. It's the sustainability crew on the one hand. Then there are private businesses, different types of businesses. There are universities like Columbia, which after all positioned itself through the Columbia Global Centers in the same way as, great universities like NUS will do the same thing, positioning themselves in relation to globalization and then themselves become actors of that. I mean, both you and Francesco and I, Shahoko, I imagine as well, are all products of academic globalization, right? And then there's the personal level. And I think many of us are experiencing this current moment as a really quite profound personal shock. How do we as individuals who made life plans on the basis of visions of globalization, how do we react? I know that from my personal circle for myself, but also from the students that I teach. I had a Chinese American student come into my office the other day and ask whether she should accept a fellowship to Beida, that she has. This is somebody who grew up bilingual, speaking Mandarin and English. She's fascinated in doing research on the Chinese American community. She thinks it might preclude the possibility of ever doing government work in the US if she accepts a Beidar scholarship. When we reach that kind of juncture, this shock is going all the way down. You know, I encouraged her to take it because it would be such a betrayal of who she is and what she's interested in if she was to refuse such an incredible offer. But I don't know in my heart of hearts whether that's good advice or bad advice. We're in a new space, right? So I would be fascinated to get the panel's view on this issue of who is going to navigate this how. That, I mean, we've been doing a lot of kind of generalized talk on the basis that the states are the key actors. Maybe Shihoko, I mean, you might find something in this. Because Japan, very pluralist society, very complex, a lot of different points of contact with the world.
Yeah, so a couple of points. When President-elect Trump came up with this idea of establishing an agency, a Department of Government Efficiency, and bringing in private sector values to the public sector, I actually gave a briefing to a group of Japanese government officials and said, this is what makes America strong. This is a very innovative approach to dealing with some of the waste that is part of the government. I'm really regretting saying this because I personally have been hurt by this. I was, until a month ago, with the Wilson Center, which is a congressionally chartered think tank. In a city full of think tanks, one would think that being one of two think tanks that were supported by a government, by the US government, would be a source of strength. But in fact, it turned out to be a position of weakness because both the Wilson Center and the USIP, the Institute for Peace, have been dismantled as a result of depending on public funds. So I share this with you because, Adam, when you talk about values moving forward, one of the strengths of the United States had been not just to provide the structure and the rules of governance when it comes to expansion and growth. The United States also gave a lot of hope, not just to its own citizens, but also to the world. It was a very aspirational country, not just because of its wealth, but because of its exceptionalism in thinking of public goods beyond its own borders. As we see countries across the region increasing their own income levels, I think we're also seeing a great deal of reflection about what it is to be a prosperous country. The biggest good example of that is Bhutan, where they do this whole measurement of happiness. And I think that when we talk to young people, I actually have two kids at Harvard, but they are focused much more on what is a more comprehensive approach to what it means to be happy, to what it means to have personal satisfaction. And Japan, it is a very stable country. The converse effect of that, it can be quite not so dynamic, but it does focus on certain social values that I believe that resonates with a lot of other countries. And neither the United States nor China is focusing a great deal about lifting all boats domestically. We talk about BRI, we talk about this type of almost a transactional relationship with the global South. I believe that Japan actually has a value set that is focused much more about empowering people at all levels. And if I give you one good example of this, of effective development assistance for the future, Japan is investing in capacity building and enhancing workforce development. And what it does is it actually it invests in people working in local advanced factories in Thailand and Vietnam and the like. At the same time, they're giving them Japanese language lessons. So the graduates of these programs end up with a degree in engineering or some kind of technical capability, but also in Japanese language. So they're not necessarily just going to be pigeonholed into doing a function, but they have that ability for upward mobility. So that gives them hope. And I believe that that kind of investment in people, and one of the big things that we share is about the role that AI can play, the concerns about employment, the concerns about what people can do in an ever competitive landscape. That kind of investment in people is something that I believe that Japan does quite well and takes into consideration when it is considering its investment policies overseas.
Thank you, Shohoko. We've got an interesting list of questions building up on the chat panel, which I'm really grateful for. But I would love to get the reactions of other panelists if they were tickled by this question. I mean, Shuping, one of the most banal stereotypes that Western analysts, so-called, sometimes bring to the China question is a monolithic view of China, right? It's a single agent, it's a single actor, it has a single strategy. To break that. Yeah,
could I talk first, because I have to leave in about 5 minutes?
Thank you so much for reminding me. Yes. I got so engrossed. Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I just want to add one point. You know that the big countries could be much more resilient to trade wars because they can specialize across different provinces. But for small economies, that is much harder to do so. So these economies, especially the small ones, will find it beneficial to join or to create more of this free trade agreement. Okay. Now, but it's not just forming free trade agreement. All the countries involved or the people involved, we have to try to understand each other as that is understand the people at the personal level or understand the cultures of other people of other countries. I remember that about half a century ago, when I was a student at the University of Chicago, there were a lot of American scholars who were genuinely interested to find out what was happening in China. And at that time, China was actually in some big trouble. That was part of the Cultural Revolution. But that did not stop these American intellectuals to try to have some major, to try to spend some major efforts to understand China. But today, the kind of ignorance among the intellectual elite or especially among the government people on China appears to me to be quite astounding. Well, as a long-time China watcher myself, I find that many of the predictions made about China by the current politicians in the US have been very inaccurate. Okay, and that is a sign that people are not interested in understanding other countries. That could be pretty bad in the very long run, and that could create even more conflicts in the future. I'm sorry that I have another Zoom conference in just about 1 minute's time, so I have to leave. Okay.
We've all been in this situation.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us this morning, and thank you for leaving us with that. Really seriously, I think it weighs on your question. And please take this panel as a gesture from Colombia's side that the interest remains. The interest remains live. Wishing you a very good evening. Shuping, I'll pivot back to you on this question of the locus of agency, the place through and the actors that might be involved in navigating this troubled world that we're in. If you could unmute.
Yes. So I think under the Mao years, within the Mao years, China was more or less monolithic country. But after Deng Xiaoping's open reform, China has never been and will never be able to go back to a monolithic country. So in terms of U.S. Trade war, U.S. Russia-Ukraine war, Israeli-Gaza, I mean, you have all kinds of different positions or stands among Chinese citizens, including intellectuals, but also I would argue businessmen and government officials. Now, in terms of agency, I think for this particular period of time, let's say under Trump 2.0 for about another almost 4 years, and I would argue only 3 sets of agency or agents are really critical for the whole world to take on the challenge which has been unleashed by Trump. One is certainly the state. In the state is the most powerful actor in terms of international relations, international system. So if a state does something entirely wrong, let's say, which I think U.S. is doing some of the things wrong, it's not just like morally, but also I would argue materially, right? So state is the most powerful actor or agency, source of agency in terms of international relations, including economics. The second set of agency, I think, comes from sub-regional or corporation or sub-regional agents from states, because I don't see a really bright future in the next couple of years at the global level, partially because the U.S. is the superpower or the reigning hegemon, and therefore it can reject most of the proposals it doesn't really like. And therefore, I would argue at the global level, including WTO, you're not going to really get too much things, right? Too much advance, too many things done. So even I would argue climate change, the U.S. is essentially giving up on that, and therefore other countries have to take on their own initiative. The third, I would argue, is really business network or business or people or business companies, because under the present trading system, due to the past more than half century of globalization, so multinational companies, but also business or networks or business people, they have been able to build a certain network, and therefore they will be able to do things which may not be able to achieve by purely state actors. So those are the 3 sets of level of agency, if you want to put that way. If I may want to add a minor one, is really I would argue we should pay special attention to the developing country or the global south, partially because after more or less 60 years or 50 years of independence, most developing countries have been able to build certain level of state capacity. So they're now in a position to pursue certain goals. Let's say 50 years, even if they had those goals, let's say economic development or political stability, they were not in a position to do so because they lacked state capacity. But now they do really have at least the minimum threshold of state capacity, and therefore we would expect, or certainly I think I would look forward to more active agency from global south.
I couldn't agree more with this idea of threshold effects. I mean, in economics, we think far too often in terms of relativities and growth rates, and we don't think enough about absolute levels. And the threshold effect, this is also critically with China, because its average GDP per capita is still very middling, but China is by no stretch of any imagination a middling phenomenon. It's the most dramatic transformation in human history, probably, that we've seen. And you wouldn't see that if you just look at the average, right? So the threshold effect and the creation of societies and cities like Shanghai and Beijing in their modern form that's the rupture that we really need to grasp at one level. And the other level, it's the Houthis, who can continue to disrupt global trade with more or less improvised drone and rocket strikes with a little bit of help from Iran, right? And become a major player in a G30, G40, or as my friend Ian Bremmer would call it, a G0 kind of world, where where there's no coordination. Francesco, I'd love to get your take, because Singapore is a preeminently fascinating location precisely from this question of the point of view of agency. How does Singapore best have agency, and what are the players that you see that are in the game?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously Singapore is a very interesting example of punching above their wave, right? And always being able to kind of make an impact. That if you look at their size on different indicators, you would be surprised. And I think is a factor also of very strong leadership and very strong capabilities. If you look at, for example, the world of central banks, the Central Bank of Singapore, MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, is highly respected. So competencies matter in this case. Listen, the conversation on non-state actors and the role in the world is old, and certainly, you know, we've been talking about it at least until the 90s. But I would argue that that conversation has always been very Western-centric.
Yes.
With a strong emphasis on the world of non-governmental actors and civil society and so on. I think the big shift today is that conversation is truly global, is for sure Asian, but is also global, would have included Latin America and Africa. We talked about cities. I think that's a very important set of players, specifically mayors as policymakers, particularly in countries that are highly decentralized. I'm thinking about Indonesia right now. It becomes fundamental level of decision making and policy making, right? That city level, right? I want to add maybe a couple of others actors that we might think about. I mean, I mentioned already the private sector with the philanthropy angle. Obviously here, when I think we bring in the private sector, and of course people start to immediately talk about technology, I think the US is still a fundamental player. Here, I mean, that shift hasn't happened. Is not the only player in town, but is certainly still a point of reference. So that's, you know, I don't see that wavering for a while. But private sector means also, as I said, philanthropy. And that is very interesting area because we know how country budgets are getting tight. And so when it comes, for example, of the huge, I would call it health deficit that we have around the world, then philanthropy becomes extremely relevant. So in particular policy areas, we're starting to talk about PPPP, so 4 Ps. Traditionally, we talk about private-public partnership. Now we talk about private-public philanthropy partnership, right? Kind of more comprehensive. And finally, let me just throw there, unfortunately, I don't belong to that category anymore, but youth. I think there is a substantive sort of transnational movements that focus around youth, particularly on certain topics that mobilize youth, climate, for example, but not only. I would even argue that probably one of the most interesting places of activity right now in the United Nations is actually the youth, right? So that's also an area. And I mentioned this because where is the youth of the world? Africa. It's certainly not in Europe. Certainly not in, you know, so the
increasingly it's not in Asia either. I mean, extraordinary.
And unfortunately, it is not in many countries. I mean, Southeast Asia is a bit of a mix. We have, you know, different phases there, but of course it's in the Middle East, right? Of course it's in Africa, in some part of Central Asia. So I mean, you start to look around and you see the demographic dynamics, also something that we want to take into consideration.
No, I have to say that one of the most impressive panels we've done recently was with a group of youth activists in Kenya. And no one should underestimate the sheer force and energy and intellectual brilliance and rhetorical power of youth movements in place in Kenya and many other parts of Africa. It's really
Kenya's doing very interesting example of digital diplomacy, for example, and other things. So absolutely,
and it will dominate the. You know, we're all kidding ourselves if we think that this isn't going to be one of the central axes of the future. Folks, this has been a great panel. I don't want to test your patience too much longer, but we do have an incredible range of questions on the chat. So maybe if I can invite the panelists to just pick one, and we'll do one final round of answers on those because they're so good. And I don't, if Chiping, Shihoko, and Francesco, you don't mind sticking around for another 10 minutes or so, I'll just quickly read them out, and then we can all just pick one or two and bundle them together. So the first one is about international organizations. In fact, there are two questions about this. What do we think the current stresses, what implications they have for international organizations and Asia's role in them? And then a question to you, Shiping, what sort of international organizations do you think might be relevant perhaps for those regional clusters that you were talking about? We have three regional type of questions. We have an ASEAN question, which is very much headed towards you, Francesco. We have a Japan question, which is very much for you, Shihoko. Like, where do we think Japan specifically will fit in this reconfiguration? And then we have Australia, if anyone wants to pick up and run with that. Obviously, a voice we might also have had in the room this morning. And then there's a question which I think could really be picked up by either Shiping or myself, which is the history, the long stretch of the transformational dynamic here. Shiping, you were sketching, a 25 to 30-year time horizon for this future development of American power, where this is, do we want to run with that? Do you want to leave that to me? Anyway, maybe we'll just go in the order we've been using. Shihoko, do you want to pick up one of these and give us an answer?
Yeah, no, these are really great. On Japan as a potential bridge builder between the United States and China, Tokyo doesn't really have that ambition per se. But what Japan is it's very self-aware. And it's aware that it unto itself is not as powerful as being able to act as a convener. So the expectation for Japan, I think, where it can truly succeed is being this convener, this force multiplier that brings together middle powers. And middle powers includes all the countries except for the United States and Japan. So it goes across, of course, the Indo-Pacific and into Europe and into the global South as well. And the shared interests are, of course, as we face all of these turmoils, especially on the economic front, there is a need for stability. There is a need for transparency, and there is a need for the adherence to the rule of law. And these are areas where both China and the United States are not seen to be champions of. So I think that is the role that Japan can play. And then one other thing, kind of going on where we left off about the power of youth and taking that into this whole realm of social change. We've seen a lot of change, and Donald Trump is simply a phenomenon. It's a manifestation of a broader disgruntlement here in the United States, but across the world as well. I think that kind of frustration is especially seen amongst the younger generation that feels stuck, that there isn't a great deal of upward mobility or the potential for them to expand and to be able to improve their lives has actually been thwarted, and they feel much more pessimistic. And I believe that the role that a government can play, a role that a country like Japan can play in particular, is to restore that kind of hope and to allow the people to be more comfortable. And this is going to lead to greater confidence in birth rates. Demographic especially is a big challenge across East Asia. And one of the biggest stumbling blocks for that is the lack of confidence about a better future and the lack of confidence about change in society and social values that would meet the needs of the changes on the economic front as well. Thanks.
I mean, I would double down on that and emphasize the gender dimension of this, because it strikes me that you can't read the politics of the far right, whether it's in South Korea, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the United States, except through the specific frustrations of young men. And the demographic crisis, on the other hand, is the reverse slope of that, which is the unwillingness of young women all over the world to accept the miserable bargain that the existing gender norms and gender relations offer them in terms of the family division of labor and the labor market. And for my own thinking about the future of the global, this gender dimension is one that I think is really very much to the fore. But rather than me banging on about my themes, Francesco, maybe I can ask you to speak a little bit about the ASEAN dimension, perhaps, and then I'll go to Shiping for a kind of wide angle wrap up.
Sure. Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question. ASEAN is a very, it's on one hand is a very solid organization. It's an organization that has a history that is there to stay, but I would also argue is fragile. And great powers need to handle ASEAN with care. And so the last things that we want is to have major powers, US and China, let's say, to kind of edge in there and kind of splitting them apart, right? Basically, the question of choosing, right? Or making direct choices between one country versus another. So that is a real challenge. It relates to what I was saying at the very beginning of this webinar, because there is a question here if the US still remain engaged in the region. So that some more longer term to see. But certainly there is that risk. And we already seen different kind of alignments on different topics. However, here I want to argue that we shouldn't think of ASEAN as sort of Western style coherent sovereign national organization. ASEAN is what I would call a sort of open regionalism, in the sense that allows states to edge, to align variably, but still remain within an ASEAN framework. So my point is, I do acknowledge that risk, but I think that there is this flexible divergence that is possible there without necessarily taking ASEAN down. So there are some risks, but I'm quite confident of ASEAN, and ultimately there are new incentives to actually go beyond, and particularly on trade. I think there are some very interesting opportunities now to really incentivize free trade in the region.
Thank you, Francesco. Another point, I would love to come back to the Indonesia question in relation to Southeast Asia. On another panel some other time, I've been watching Konfrontasi, historical documentaries, and that period of Southeast Asian history makes the current moment look so tame by comparison. Like it's, we really don't understand the dynamics that were unleashed, and we misunderstand it. The 70s was the great nightmare in many respects. The 60s are this extraordinary build-up, and historical perspective.
And sorry to make this, and of course to you, I'm always feel humble just to say that. But obviously, all these dynamics are very recent compared to Europe, right? The Europe had that kind of history as well, but it's added back. So here it's so recent.
One of the things you really realize talking to policy elites in Singapore is they're still worried about Indonesia.
Yeah, of course.
They're like, seriously, this is their big concern about what happens.
But that's an argument to say that how even more remarkable ASEAN is.
Yeah, precisely. That's what I meant by this fragility and not disrupting it, because we far too easily presume the stability of an entire region that actually, when you break it down, Japan, China, South Korea, Singapore look like the stable anchoring elements. Shipping. Be great to get your.
Thank you, Adam. Let me take on the international organization just very quickly. I have already mentioned, I think at the global level, not much can be done. So for international organization in which, any international organization in which US has a veto power or has a controlling share like the World Bank, I don't think we really should expect too much, because the US is just not in the mood of doing or offering public goods or providing public goods as it used to be. The second, I would briefly talk about Shihoko and myself, the same question, really regional cooperation. I would argue, so certainly for East Asia, China wants to be part of.
Oh no. Perhaps while we wait, I will try and answer the final question. And if Xiaoping comes back, then we'll wrap then. And otherwise, that will be the end of what has been a really fantastic panel. It's so unfortunate this glitch had happened in the last minute. I mean, the question is put to me as a historian, I guess. This is the question. From a historical perspective, what are the two
Sorry,
mostly?
I don't know.
Ping,
It's because my web crashed or the whole thing crashed.
No, just you.
Oh, just you.
But
Sorry. Okay.
Just keep
Okay,
on
let
going,
me
though.
briefly reconnect. And so I would argue, regional organization, regional cooperation organization, including ASEAN, including China, ASEAN Free Trade Area, and also Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think those are the venues in which regional countries can try to work with and cope with the current, headwinds imposed by U.S. Finally, I'm going to leave the final words to Adam, but I want to take on the U.S.-China a little bit. And I think, there was a very famous quote in The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And if I may translate as kind of a verbally, I will be, being undefeatable is waging yourself. Being defeatable is waging your enemy. So essentially, I would argue the U.S.-China competition, neither side will be able to really claim a standing victory over the other side if the other side does most of the things right. So they can only be defeated by themselves. They cannot be really defeated by the other countries. So this is why I would argue, I think both China and the United States, the domestic pressure, the domestic challenges are perhaps more pressing than the international one, because China can certainly handle the economic pressure put on upon itself by the United States. In the long run, I think neither side should overestimate their power of imposing their will upon the other side, and they should not really underestimate the other side's resilience, but also the kind of sustainability of their economic power. So I would argue, I think it will be their interest, in both countries' interest, for them to realize that they cannot really defeat the other side, at least not easily, without paying a huge cost, and therefore they may be able to come to the table. But it really depends on whether the United States side wants to achieve such a compromise or grand bargain, because the Chinese side has no hope or wish to really dethrone the United States as a hegemon, because the Chinese side, we don't want to be the global policeman or the global hegemon waging wars all over the world, because we understand waging wars all over the world actually going to bring more enemies, more enmity against your interest. So, but we don't know. I mean, I think in the next couple of months, we'll be able to see whether they can come to a negotiation table. And certainly, I would argue they are in a position to achieve a grand bargaining or a certain compromise, so that each country can actually save their precious resource, investing some into more productive domestic project, rather than trying to crush each other with tariffs or some other things. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much. This has been such a great panel. I will try and give the capsule answer to this question, because it's been trailed so often. I mean, whenever people invite me as a historian to comment on issues like this, I try to remind myself that history can have two functions. One is to remind you of similarities with the past, and the other is to indicate to you when something truly radically novel happens. In other words, against the backdrop of all prior experience, has there ever been anything like this? And I would strongly argue that there has never been anything like the rise of Asia that we have seen in the last half century. There is no reason to think there has ever been anything like it. This is the world map, the world population, and its history is divided the way it is. And so we fundamentally mislead ourselves when we look too hard and too fast and too determinedly for analogy. And specifically the idea that the current moment is like 1914 between the British Empire and Imperial Germany, or the current moment is like 1940s, where the United States, in a friendly takeover, inherited much of the British imperial structure. let alone that the current moment is like 1989, where the United States humiliates in Europe, in the European Cold War, the Soviet Union and its allies. I find all of these profound, and these are dangerous. These analogies are profoundly dangerous for understanding our current moment. And the challenge in the current moment is whether the political elites are in the key players, many of which we've spoken about today, can really adjust to the sheer drama of the novel reality that we're in, including all of its challenges, global demography, the climate change, and the presence of these giant powers on the one hand, and an incredible proliferating range of powers which have crossed that critical threshold to just being able to act in the world, which Xiaoping introduced earlier on. And so I think that's what makes this current conjuncture so fascinating. That's why these sorts of global conversations about this world are just indispensable. I take the point that several members of the panel made that really states, regional configurations, and business are the key player, but I persist in the belief that intellectual exchange between experts is indispensable, and we can see in America in the current moment how disastrous it is when that breaks down and that level of respect breaks down. And I can testify from personal experience that that is not true in Beijing, and that Western expertise is welcomed and appreciated and incorporated in ways which is at this moment, unfortunately, not true in the reverse. And so in that spirit, I just want to thank everyone who was here this morning, that took part, that was in the audience, our great partners in Beijing, for helping us put this on. And I look forward to many more conversations in future with all of you. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening in Asia, great day in the West.